Tahir is a writer and an academic affiliated with the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University, Ireland. His research interests include youth politics and social movements. He wrote his PhD dissertation on the post 2008 narratives of the Kashmiri youth, exploring the discursives, strategies employed by the Kashmiri youth authors to frame the Kashmir conflict, articulate their political grievances, affirm their distinct political identity, and counter the assimilationist discourses of the state. Before joining DCU in 2014 and completing his MA in International Peace Studies from the International University of Japan, he also worked as a correspondent and feature writer for Kashmir's largest English daily, Greater Kashmir. Tahir has written on Kashmir on different international publications, including Armed Conflict Survey, RTE, LCE Blogs, Asia Dialogues, and many more. Without further ado, I'm going to give Tahir the floor so he could start his presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shaji, for the introduction. And I'm really grateful to Mansi and the whole team for organizing this talk on Kashmir. So I will be speaking on the discourses on the Kashmir conflict from the academic side of it. So let me start by giving you a brief overview of the conflict. I assume that people who are watching right now have some kind of an information or background knowledge about the Kashmir conflict. So let me just briefly recap it. So there are two intertwined aspects to the Kashmir conflict. One is the interstate aspect, which deals with the militarized contestation over the disputed Himalayan region and erstwhile princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. And then there's the aspect where you have the struggle of people of Jammu and Kashmir for their right to self-determination. So when we talk about the Kashmir conflict, so it has two aspects: conflict on Kashmir, which involves India and Pakistan, and conflict in Kashmir, which involves people of Jammu and Kashmir and the Indian state. And if we look at this conflict in Kashmir aspect, so you will look at how the people of Kashmir have organized themselves. Say, for example, the plebiscite front, which came in 1955 and dissolved in 1975, then JKLF in late 1960s, and in late 1980s, they started an armed struggle. And then in 1993, Hurriyat came into existence and represented the political aspirations of the people of Kashmir. So when this armed uprising started in late 1980s, Indian state deployed nearly 500,000 security personnel to Kashmir to crush that armed uprising. And the state that ensued by the state and non-state actors led to around 50,000 deaths. And human rights organizations have documented nearly 8,000 cases of enforced disappearances and as many cases of sexual violence against Kashmiri women. And then you have this recent youth-led political mobilizations, which happened post-2008, and also new age, what is called as new age militancy. So that new age militancy actually was triggered by the suppression of the street protests that happened in 2010. And this new age militancy became a full-blown insurgency by 2015. And since 2008, 3,550 people have been killed, including more than 2,000 insurgents. So that's giving you a brief overview of the conflict for those who may not be familiar with the Kashmir conflict. So now coming to the discourses on the Kashmir conflict. So the most used term within the Kashmiri society and by the political organizations within Kashmir is Masla Kashmir. So Kashmir is framed as a masla. Masla means something which is an issue and needs to be resolved. So we can trace the genealogy or trace the genesis of this term to the earlier speech. Like it has a context. It has a context in 1947 when India and Pakistan got divided and there was contestation over the state of Jammu and Kashmir. So this Masla Kashmir as a term originates from there. And we can look at correspondences and public speeches of first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, Government of India White Papers of 1948, and UN resolutions on India-Pakistan question, and associated political and diplomatic arguments and contestation between the main actors in the dispute. So Masla Kashmir is the Urdu term, but it derives from the English terms like plebiscite or resolution of the Kashmir conflict. So all these terms actually imply an unresolved issue. So that has been a dominant frame, a dominant discursive operative term within Kashmir for a long time, and still is. Now coming to the academic part of it, there has been two dominant frames in the academics when they talked about Kashmir conflict. The first one is interstate framing, which looks at India-Pakistan sovereignty claims over Jammu and Kashmir based on 1947 partition. And it privileges the nation state and focuses on historical, geopolitical, and legal complexities of the interstate contestation. So the problem with this framing is that it marginalizes the indigenous voices and experience of the armed conflict. And then there is another dominant frame through which Kashmir has been looked at, and that's institutional building frame or institutional frame. It looks at India-Kashmir relationship in the context of federalism and focus on post-colonial institution building processes. But the problem with this framing is that it tends to fall back on what John Cockell calls the precast status parameters of inquiry, which regards the Kashmiri resistance as a reaction to the closure of institutional avenues by the state and not an expression of an autonomous political agency. And in recent years, almost from last one decade, a more critical scholarship on Kashmir has emerged. And it's called critical Kashmir studies. What critical Kashmir studies does is it challenges these dominant framings of the Kashmir conflict and interrogates entrenched epistemologies on Kashmir. It looks at the categories of territory, identity, resistance as a consequence of power differentials structured by governmentality, occupation, and institutionalized denial of justice. And it foregrounds Kashmiri perspectives, Kashmiri experiences, and looks at the Indian rule and opposition to it in Kashmir in their varied forms and everyday context. So for example, one of the examples of this critical Kashmir studies is Resisting Occupation in Kashmir, which came in 2008. It was an edited volume which looked at Kashmiri experience of the occupation from an ethnographical point of view. But there is a context in which all these framings have happened: interstate, institutional building, and critical studies. I'm getting some kind of message in here. Why do Muslims? I'm getting some kind of very problematic message here on my screen.
I think Monty will go ahead and take care of that. Yes, just
okay,
keep
thank
on.
you. All right. So the context of all these framings, I talked about Masla Kashmir as the most used term in Kashmiri political discourses. And I talked about interstate framing and institution building framing. So there is a context for all these different framings. And one thing which I want to point out about the earliest writings on Kashmir is that they were mostly written by non-Kashmiri authors. So you had Jos Corbel, who was a diplomat. You had Lord Birdwood, who was associated with the British royalty. You had Michael Brecker. You had Norman Palmer. So all these authors were non-Kashmiris who wrote about Kashmir, and they wrote in the proximity of the 1947 partition and all that. Can you just remove this? There is one more text here.
She'll take care of that.
Okay, so, because it was coming on my slide. So all these earliest writings in Kashmir were actually a response to the political deadlock over the. Now my slide is gone, not gone, but something is on there. Okay, sorry. So these earliest writings were a response to the political deadlock over the question of Jammu and Kashmir, and they mostly dealt with this question of whether Kashmir should join the newly created domains of India and Pakistan, right? And then the institution building framing in the academic discourses had the context of the armed movement in the late 1980s. So political violence was the context in which that framing was done. And there was another context in which this interstate framing was, this is really disturbing. Whoever is doing it is not cool. I'm getting really
Let me,
offensive messages on my screen,
yeah, we're going
and
to
this
have
looks
to.
really,
Tahir, we're
this
trying
does
to
not
figure
look
that out
nice.
right now. If you can just ignore it for now, and we'll try to figure out how to. Yes, someone's trying to.
The problem is coming on my slides, and there are like very offensive graphics being displayed on my slides, and I cannot concentrate on my slides. I'm sorry for that.
Do you think you can do it without your screen for now and just continue the chatting?
Well, okay. What I can do is that
If
whoever
you
this
stop
loser
sharing
is,
the screen, I think it.
I can just ignore him, and I will try to concentrate on my own slides. Is that okay?
Yeah, that would be.
Okay. So what I was saying is that the context of these different framings has to be taken into consideration, right? So uh, so the framing where they looked at Kashmir from this interstate perspective was the 1998 nuclear test by these both countries, and so this geopolitical and geostrategic uh, context was in which this interstate framing was again being used to understand Kashmir conflict. And then now in recent years, you had this youth-led political mobilizations, which is the context in which critical Kashmir studies also looks at the Kashmir conflict, right? So moving forward, among the among the earliest authors who looked at Kashmir from this institutional building perspective was Sumit Ganguly, right? And Sumit Ganguly basically forwarded this idea of uh, denial of democracy with relation to Kashmir as a reason why why this insurgency started in Kashmir. So his argument was that it was denial of democracy that led to the eruption of Kashmir insurgency. And he looked at it from the perspective of modernization, and he drew from Samuel Huntington's theory of modernization, and which talked about that rapid economic progress, far from contributing to democracy, can lead to political instability in the absence of robust political institutions. And Ganguly was saying that Kashmir represents both the mobilization success and simultaneously the institutional failure of Indian democracy. So what does that mean? The basic idea that
I'm so
the
sorry.
armor, yeah.
Uh, do you think you can just stop sharing your screen and we can do the rest of this talk without your screen?
Wait a second. Yeah, I will stop share, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I stopped it.
All right, so just your face will be shown. You guys could continue this talk. Once you be talking, your face will automatically come up as the one that's displayed for everybody. So continue.
All right. So what I was saying was that within the institutional perspective, there are some authors which were the main ones who forward this argument, and the main argument was that denial of democracy argument. So, for example, Sumit Ganguly was saying that the armed militancy in Kashmir occurred because institutional structure of post-colonial India did not accommodate Kashmir's political demands, as they became politically more assertive after gradual modernization and increased literacy. So basically, Indian state was providing, say, for example, say education and um, creating all this infrastructure and all that. So that what that did was that it created a critical mass of politically aware Kashmiri population, which started to demand their political rights. But Indian state could not accommodate those political demands from the Kashmiris. So that ultimately led to instability and ultimately to the eruption of the armed conflict in late 1980s. Sumantra Bose also argued more or less in the similar vein, and his main argument was that Kashmir's strong urge for secession is a result of Indian state's consistent policy of denying democracy to the people of Kashmir. And these arguments were also advanced by some other scholars who wrote in the post 1990 period when the armed insurgency had happened in Kashmir. So some of the talking points of this denial of democracy argument was that Indian state had this interventionist role in Kashmiri politics. For example, they talk about this dismissal of elected Chief Minister Farooq Abdullah in 1984. Uh, national conferences accord with Congress and the rigged elections in 1987 as the main events which led to the eruption of the armored insurgency, right? So in this same period, there was Rita Chaudhary Tremblay, who looked at Kashmir from the same perspective, but she emphasized on the economic aspects as well. So she was arguing that shrinking career opportunities for the urban middle class combined with closed avenues for the expression of their political dissent was the main motivating factor for secessionist movement. And I think she was the first one among these academics who actually looked at Article 370 as a problematic, as a reason for secessionism nurturing in Kashmir. She said that Article 370 and the separate state laws, which are in Jammu and Kashmir, is the reason why Kashmiris have developed this sense of separate identity from mainland India. She was one of the earliest ones to talk on those lines. So while these are plausible explanations for the eruption of the armed uprising in Kashmir, but these are inadequate to explain the resurgence of strong anti-India resistance in the post-2008 period. They're inadequate also because they cannot explain why would people get ready to die because they were not allowed to express their political aspirations through institutionalized medium. And they cannot answer the question why call to arms so suddenly resonated strongly across the people of Kashmir, or why people so broadly supported the armed uprising at that point. And also importantly, why would people demand Azadi, independence, or merger with Pakistan if all the fight was about genuine elections or political liberties? These are the questions which remain somehow unaddressed in these institution building framing. So one of the earliest scholars to criticize systematically these dominant framings was John Cockle. He wrote this article in Nation and Nations, where he talked about how these institutional, these dominant framings deny Kashmiris their political agency. So he says, for example, that though institutional perspectives or framings acknowledge the state wrongdoings and failure of institutions, they effectively deny the Kashmiri community any autonomous political agency outside of that defined by these institutions, failed or otherwise. So he was saying that we need a decentered perspective that considers historical pattern of alternative extra systemic political formations which manifest subaltern insurgent consciousness or socio-cultural identity among Kashmiris. So he gives examples of, say, national conference before 1947, right, when they fought against the Dogra state. They talk about, he gave the example of plebiscite front, JKL in 1970s, and various protest groups which emerged around that time, and MUF, Muslim United Front in 1980s, and Hurriyat in 1990s. All these are, for him, extra systemic formations, political formations, which manifested insurgent consciousness of Kashmiri community. Cockle said that while a state has an institution-specific understanding of the legitimacy of ethnic opposition, ethnic political culture is based on deeper value-specific issues of genealogical identity and group security. The antagonism between post-colonial Indian state and the Kashmiri resistance movement derives from what Cockle calls as structural paralysis, which arises out of incompatibility between Kashmiri autonomous political agency informed by identity consciousness and Indian state institutional approach. So what is structural paralysis is that there is irreconcilability between the two understandings, between what Kashmiris understand as this group security and what India understands as a legitimate form of ethnic opposition. And this irreconcilability between these two understandings creates structural paralysis, which creates a vacuum in which coercion and oppression appear to be the only options open to the state ruling elite. So that was John Cockle, who was one of the earliest scholars to kind of critique the dominant framings, both interstate and institution building framings, right? So now let's look at the post 2008, the scenario in which some Indian academics and journalists have also tried to frame the Kashmir conflict, because now the context has changed. It's no longer about armed conflict or understanding the 1947 partition and all that. It's now to understand why youth is participating in these political mobilizations, right? So one of the persons to write about this post 2008 period, like particularly focusing on the youth, was actually a journalist, David Davidas. And if you look at his arguments, I pulled out 3 arguments from his book. And what is he saying? He's saying that the new generation of Kashmiris who took part in the street protests in 2016 were angered by counterinsurgency excesses and police harassment. And secondly, he says that certain narratives influenced their responses, and these narratives were orchestrated. He uses the term orchestrated, and reflected the post-truth. And thirdly, he says that policymakers did not realize that a generation which came of age around 2007 wanted peace with dignity, and thus lost a golden opportunity by not winding down the counterinsurgency grid. So these are the main arguments in his book. And what does that imply? So what these arguments imply is this: that in the absence of harassment by the counterinsurgency apparatus, there would have been no anti-India revolt in Kashmir. Secondly, that if narratives and perceptions are somehow managed, the Kashmiri youth would not revolt against the state. And thirdly, that the resistance in Kashmir was born due to the state harassment, and there is no historical struggle against the status quo, which people of different backgrounds have joined regardless of the circumstances. So now you look at this book, and now you would wonder which perspective this book is giving, or under which paradigm he's talking about. So we already talked about interstate and institutionalist perspective. So what is the perspective he is employing here? So I think I would call it for now neo-institutionalist framework, because this somehow goes beyond what Sumit Ganguly or Sumantra Bose or Rekha Tremblay said earlier in the context of the armed uprising, but it's still confined to the institutionalist understanding of the resistance in Kashmir. And in the similar framework, Gautam Nair's recent article can be read, where he is trying to understand if exposure to violence actually widens the gap between peripheral minority and the nation. So he looks at Kashmir as a peripheral minority, and India as a nation, and he looks at this dynamic of violence and national identification. And he says, although he acknowledges that majority of the people in Kashmir are pro-resistance, and he cites this particular survey that they had done based on 2,500 people. He acknowledges that resistance is supported by a large section of Kashmir people, but yet the operative terms within his paper are problematic, because he uses the terms like peripheral minority. So looking at Kashmir as something peripheral to India, which has to be managed, right? And he looks at Kashmiri identity as a regional identity, not as a national identity, or as a distinct identity in its own right. And also he used the word like integration, and as if the idea behind this paper is to provide answers to the policymakers how to better how to better their hearts and minds doctrine, or how to better manage the conflict in Kashmir, and not understanding the Kashmiri resistance from the perspective of Kashmiri people, right? So, but one of the interesting findings of this paper was, and I quote, "We find that the psychological distance that is created by active conflict in Kashmir cannot be overcome by the perceived benefits of India's growing economic power or by efforts to integrate Kashmiri youth in state institutions." So basically, he was looking at this program, Sadbhavna program, and there are certain programs initiated by the Indian state to kind of wean away Kashmiri youth from the resistance or kind of Indianize them. So he's saying that these particular programs haven't been so successful because psychological gap between Indian state and Kashmiris has only widened, and as long as violence is there, it is not going to be bridged anytime sooner. And ultimately, finally, I would conclude uh, by reading out from Muhammad Junaid, who also looks at Kashmir from a critical perspective. Uh, he has written this paper called Counter Maps of the Ordinary, and it was published last year in Identities Journal. And this paper represents a critical Kashmir studies, the way critical Kashmir studies approach the Kashmir conflict, looking at the experience of the people of Kashmir, looking at how they deal or navigate the militarization which is prevalent in their region. So I will conclude by reading out this passage from his paper. Analysis of Kashmiri practices of protest demand that we recognize that people living under occupation may not reveal a clear script of resistance. They respond to state control with adeptness, agility, and cunning. We need a fuller appreciation of their political projects, which might be formulated in the languages of global justice and shaped by historic senses of belonging to a place, but are invariably centered on pragmatic strategies of producing or preserving the public space of politics and ordinary life. So, in this presentation, I was trying to give you, the broader overview of some of the framings of the Kashmir conflict, and my mind was totally disturbed by uh, this loser, whoever it was, who put on those offensive comments on my slides and the graphics. But I hope that whatever I said in this presentation made sense to you. And yeah, these are three framings on the Kashmir: interstate, institutionalist, and critical Kashmir studies. So that is end of my presentation. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer.
Absolutely. So jumping back to the Indian administered Kashmir, can you describe the framing of Kashmir conversation in India and the reasons for that framing? And how does this differ from the framing of the Kashmir conflict in an international context?
Yeah, so there was this study done in 2013 where a Kashmiri scholar of media studies looked at three English newspapers and their editorials, and the framings which he could identify, the main framings or the dominant framings in those editorials was uh, law and order framing, like Kashmir is being seen as a law and order problem which has to be managed by the state, and the security problem in terms of how the neighboring state is threatening the security of the state. So these are the two framings which Indian media has been pushing for a long time, and it has become an entrenched framing, and it's very kind of simplistic way of looking at the Kashmir conflict.
Okay. All right. That puts some perspective into it. So the significance of the different types. So what's the significance of different types of framing within the politics of India, I should say?
Yeah, obviously, there is this saying, give bad name to a dog and kill him, kind of a thing. Like, if you're looking at something as bad or projecting it as something, you know, threatening to the security of the state or something as anti-national, then obviously more repressive measures become justified in the eyes of the people. So if you have observed, before August 5th, 2019, for 1 year or almost, there was continuous prime time discussions on Kashmir. Every night or every other night, there will be prime time discussions on Kashmir. And it was building up, right? So there was this particular negative framing being used to look at the Kashmir as people who are anti-national, who threaten Kashmir, and who believe in tukde and all that stuff, and who need to be cut to their size and all that stuff. So that has implications, obviously.
So the so that's a good segue to how we look at the Kashmiri youth now. I know your dissertation is the voices of the Kashmiri youth post 2008. And now recently, when you see the Kashmiri freedom fighting movement, you see it backed up by the Kashmiri youth. And oftentimes they're painted in a negative light in Indian publications. Can we talk about the Kashmiri youth and their relation to freedom fighting, and in a framing and almost in a historical academic approach? Why is there almost how we can look at taking up arms in a without demonizing the Kashmiri youth, because that's essentially what's happened within India, demonizing the Kashmiri youth. So would you like to speak on that for a bit?
You see, so the framing of Kashmiri youth as, say, terrorists, or Kashmir being a problem of terrorism, it picked up after the Kargil war, actually. Or this became a talking point in the government discourses, or as a precondition for any resolution of the Kashmir conflict, that in government started to saying, first Pakistan has to stop terrorism in Kashmir, then we will come to the table, or we will talk about Kashmir. It actually started after the Kargil war, and this was deliberately done to kind of scuttle the peace process or whatever. In terms of how to look at Kashmiri youth participation in freedom in this armed movement, or in the right to self-determination movement, and not frame it not to frame it negatively. Do you mean, I didn't get your question properly? Like, are you asking me that how to frame Kashmiri youth participation in politics or in self-determination movement without looking at it from the status perspective? I'm not able to hear you.
Once again, yes, that is my question. Yes.
That's your question, right? So from academic perspective, we can say there has been a generational shift in Kashmir. So if you look at 1989, or like the first armed movement, or armed struggle, it was also initiated or led by the youth, and this youth was shaped in the context of 1970s or 1960s, when this 1965 war happened between India and Pakistan. So till then, there was this talk about plebiscite happening in Kashmir, and people were hopeful, and then it was being delayed and delayed and delayed. And then in 1965, in 1960s, there was huge unrest within Kashmir, and it was mostly the youth, the students, who were doing it. So you could see that youth was coming of age, politically speaking. So this was the youth that ultimately started becoming politically assertive, and also, becoming amenable to the violent method. Because what really pushed them was firstly the 1975 accord between Sheikh Abdullah and Indira Gandhi, because that was seen as a betrayal of this plebiscite front, which was pursuing this non-violent struggle for the resolution of the Kashmir conflict under the United Nations resolutions. But when that accord happened, these youth and students who had become politically assertive at that time kind of lost faith in the political leadership of Kashmir. And then they had these clandestine or these groups, smaller groups here and there scattered around. And then they came together in 1980s and formed one group called MUF. And then when the elections were rigged, they the same group then embraced armed movement or start the armed movement. So you can look at it as generation from a generational perspective. Same happened in post 2008 period. There was this period when insurgency was at its peak, it was crashed, then people were really kind of terrorized. So there was huge state pressure on people. They couldn't speak much. But then there was this opening political opportunity happened after 2004. Peace process was started between India and Pakistan. So India was slowly opening up opportunities in terms of how you could speak or you could talk or you could write books and all that. And but then 2008, this Amarnath land row happened, and uh, the youth which was coming of age during that time was initiated into political rebellion because of that particular agitation which happened in 2008. And then in 2010, the same youth then was on the streets and leading the protests. And when the state repressed those protests, when they were arrested in huge numbers and tortured in jails, and state was like not allowing them any more political freedoms, these youth then started this new age militancy, which started in 2003, or which kind of came into scene in 2013, and then became a full-blown insurgency by 2015. And now you can see in 2012, 84 insurgents were killed in a year. But after that, slowly and gradually, it started picking up. And in 2018, you had almost 2,060 insurgents killed in a year. That means the number of Kashmiri youth joining the insurgency had been going up. And the reason was the repression of the 2010 civil protests or the street protests.
So we often juxtapose the Palestine conflict with the conflict, and the settler project that is in West Bank is obviously in further works than this new project that seems to be underway. Do you see that? That's the aim that the Indian government is looking for, something to model off of the West Bank settlers project? Or
there are indications that they are actually following that, because immediately after this revocation of Article 370, if you had seen, there was this Indian consul to New York, Sandeep Chakraborty, who was speaking to a private gathering, but that video got leaked and was viralized in international media. So he's saying, oh, well, this has happened in the Middle East, when they can do it, when the Israeli people can do it, why cannot we do it? So that gives you an indication, because he is a representative of the government, right? And he's assuring the audience that we are going to do something there which is on the model of Israel, is what Israel is doing in West Bank or in Palestine. So there is some indications that they will be following, or they are in fact following what Israel has done in West Bank.
Right. So with all these politicians, I guess, falling in line, we've mentioned Abdullahs, the Muftis. So which politician or which identity or who is out there that the Kashmiri youth identify with most, that they gravitate towards most, that they look to as a viable politician that stands for them? And I guess, why are they disenchanted with others, politicians that are veteran politicians in Kashmir?
This has been the case with Kashmir since 1947. In 1960s, when the plebiscite front, which was representing the right to self-determination movement, when when the youth of that time started to feel or sense that these people are now hobnobbing with the state or kind of trying to become the managers of the state, they heckled them. Like Maulana Masudi was one of the veterans who had been, instrumental in, anti-Dogra movement and all that. He was heckled in Hazrat Bal, in the Dargah Hazrat Bal. So right now, the youth of Kashmir are also disenchanted by the leadership.
Yeah.
And also there is this continued uncertainty happening because the state is not letting them rest or have a breath, because something or other is happening every other week, every other month, every other day, be it like domicile law in the pandemic, be it arrest of Masud Zahra today, be it some other thing happening. So continuously state is doing something which keeps people disturbed and not allowing them to organize or have some kind of an introspection or some kind of a debate among themselves how to proceed further. So this particular phase in Kashmir is quite uncertain politically and quite disturbing as well, because there are these pent-up emotions which may burst somewhere in the future, because when you keep something under pressure for a long time, it all eventually bursts. So this is a period when everything has been put under the lid. So when will it blow up? Nobody knows.
Right. So those are the questions we had left. Tahir, thank you for speaking to us all. We have reached our time. I do want to formally apologize for what happened in the beginning. I didn't say anything about it in the beginning, but you are an esteemed speaker and certainly do not deserve something like that. And I think everyone that is in this group and participants that are here do acknowledge that, and we do really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's okay. I can deal with it now.
It comes with the territory.
It comes. We have to deal with all these kind of things all the time. So.
Right. Okay. So that concludes our session today. So thank you for being here, and take care.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you everyone for watching. Somehow I'm not